posterior to that, a single gyrus that goes on either cerebral hemisphere, and we call this the precentral gyrus. Its function is motor cortex. What does it do? That's where signals in the top part of your brain initiate to go downward and eventually out to muscles. That information passes out to muscles to cause your muscles to contract. So this area would be under conscious control, if you will. This is where those electrical signals are initiated and then passed downward into the spinal cord and then out to through motor neurons, what we call somatic motor neurons, if you remember that, because the somatics division only innervates skeletal muscle. Are you getting all this? I mean, also, from this point forward, this is called the frontal lobe. From that point back to about where the yellow, I don't know whether you can see this, where this yellow area begins, that would be all parietal lobe. Over here on the side, temporal lobe, and then this yellow and green area at the back would be what is called the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe. Okay? Any questions about this? So this is where you control skeletal muscles. This is where you initiate it from. Now, the decision to actually cause those muscles to contract is made out here in the frontal lobe. There are decision-making areas that then pass that information over to this area and then downward to the muscles. Okay? And then, of course, this structure, the cerebellum, has to oversee the coordination of those skeletal muscles contractions. Otherwise, they may be very jerky movements. And in fact, if you damage the cerebellum, you get what is called an ataxia, meaning literally that you have uncoordinated movements. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, very important in coordinating those muscle contractions, even though they're initiated right in this area right here. Okay, you all right with this? Okay. Then, posterior to that central sulcus, we have another gyrus. It's called the precentral gyrus. And you're going to notice on this model that they have written on this gyrus different parts of the body. So there's an entire representation of the body, just like over here you can see for the motor cortex a representation of the entire body. These regions here are going to control muscles in various parts of the body, very specific parts. And we know that because whenever years ago they started operating on the brains, they would do a local anesthetic, cut into the skull, and there's no pain receptors on the brain. So the brain can't feel pain, okay? Now you can register it in the extremities, and it's perceived in the brain, but the brain itself doesn't have pain receptors. So they will go in there and they'll just cut open with the person awake, and they stimulate various areas, and they'll say, oh, well, what will happen is a muscle will jump, and they'll know that in fact that that's the area that controls that part of the body. So there are very specific regions that control different parts.
Are we responsible for knowing?
No. I just want you to appreciate it. I just want you to appreciate it. That's all. Just an appreciation for it, okay?
It's amazing.
And then this post-central gyrus, again with a representation of the entire body on it, this is where we sense what are called somatic sensations, things that receptors that are scattered over the surface of the body, and if you touch the skin in a certain location, that information passes in up through the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is a relay station, and then up to this area. So if this is the right side as the right cerebral hemisphere, if you touch somebody on the left side, say on the hand, that is where that sensation would be perceived. Right there. Okay. Now, you may not know the meaning of that touch, and that's where these areas, in this light blue area here, this is called an association area, and it allows you to interpret the meaning of that touch, for example. Does that make sense? So we have these areas of the brain that are called association areas that do much of the interpretation of what we are sensing in our environment. Everybody all right with this? Okay, this is called, by the way, the primary sensory cortex. So please learn those, because I will ask you these, I promise, on the exam.
What was the red
This
one
is
called?
the pre-central gyrus. This one is the post-central gyrus. The pre-central gyrus is involved, or functionally called the primary motor cortex. It controls skeletal muscle contractions. The primary sensory cortex is associated with the post-central gyrus. And again, this is what sensations that we can detect over the surface of our skin, typically. Okay?
So those two will both need to know for the
You need to know for the exam. Now, I will not ask it on this model. You see that model over there that doesn't
The
have
white
any,
one?
yeah, that white one with the blue and the pink. That's how I'm going to ask it, because none of those things are labeled. Okay? Shucks. Well, you know what I've done in the past, before we had those, I just actually covered these up with little stickers so that you couldn't see it.
Could you go over one more time the what'd you call it?
Oh, longitudinal fissure?
Okay, so you got the
And
longitudinal
then-
fissure.
And then
Dura
that
mater.
there's a blood vessel, a very large lumen. Everybody understand what I mean by that?
Yes.
Just a large cavity that's inside. In fact, so big you can see it there. I could stick this probe down into that. Okay, that's
Okay.
how big it is.
Okay.
But that's where most of the cerebral spinal fluid gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream.
And what's that cavity called?
Wait,
Didn't you say, or that lumen? I'm sorry.
No, the vessel is called superior sagittal sinus.
The superior
A sinus is a very thin-walled, large lumen vessel.
Okay.
That's how we define a sinus. Okay,
Okay. And that reabsorbs cerebrospinal fluid?
that's what it does.
Okay.
Is that all right? Any questions about this? Okay. It takes a while for this all to register. I know. Okay. Now, on this side, and I know on the ventral side, you had an illustration of this. Starting right here, remember these kind of bulb-like structures? These are called the olfactory bulbs. And then you can just see it. It's kind of flattened, but this is a cranial nerve number 1 that carries information about smell into the brain where it'll be perceived. So we call this nerve right here, we call it the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1. Then it's been cut off here, but there would have been, let me see if
Pituitary
there's,
gland.
well, the pituitary would have been right here. This is where it would have attached, right in this point. But right here would have been the optic nerves, and then many of the sensory nerve fibers coming from either eye cross over at this point. And what did we say the crossover point was? There's a name for it. It's called the optic chiasma. The
Optic chiasma.
optic chiasma. It's a crossover point right here. I wish I had a better one to show you, but unfortunately, this is the only one I could grab that was intact. Everybody right with this? So that would be optic nerves or cranial nerves number 2. Got that? Then cranial nerves number 3, and it looks like they have been totally lost. Oh my goodness. Here's one of them. Everybody see that? Well, you know, on this one, if I had, unfortunately, I don't have the other half to this. But right here's the optic chiasma, here's the optic nerve, and then right there is one of a pair of what we call oculomotor nerves, which control the eyes, okay, the movement of the eyes.
And you're going from ventral to dorsal?
Yeah. I'm going from anterior to posterior
Okay.
on this, okay? So this is called the oculomotor, and they are on that ventral midbrain region. This would be the little mammillary body. And then right here, even though it's not easily visible, there's cranial nerve number 5. Let me see if this one shows it. And the answer is barely. It would be right there. And then I think that may be a little part of it right there. But this is called the trigeminal nerve. Okay? It's a big nerve that feeds into the face. And that nerve contains both sensory fibers as well as motor fibers to control muscles in the facial region. And I think I may have mentioned to a couple groups that somebody that has damage to that, there have been instances of suicide where they've actually committed suicide because it's so painful. Yeah, if you have what they call a trigeminal nerve neuropathy, okay, where you've had damage to that nerve, it can be very painful.
What hurts?
I don't know why, just, it stimulates a lot of pain receptors, and those
In
pain
your
receptors
face or
just,
just
yeah, from the
everywhere?
face, from the facial area. And it just seems to, create so much pain that the person can't stand it, and they will
And
commit
there's
suicide.
nothing that they can do, like doctor-wise or anything?
You know, they can give, well, I think some of the newer drugs,
Mm-hmm.
there are some very new drugs that are focused on relieving pain symptoms.
probably
And I
crazy
think
expensive.
nowadays they can probably, treat this a little
Yeah.
bit better. Okay. But a few years back, they couldn't. Okay, they just didn't have
Probably
the
expensive
drugs to do
drugs,
that.
too.
And then I told you there was one, and I don't know whether this is it right here. See it coming out from the edge, the lateral edges of the medulla? Cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus nerve. It's called the vagus. It is part of the parasympathetic division, which maintains body functions under resting conditions. And so this is the only nerve, the only cranial nerve that goes below the level of the neck, and it will innervate virtually every major ventral body cavity organ. And it helps to maintain homeostasis in those organs under resting conditions. Okay? And remember, you only activate the sympathetic division, which is the other opposing system, only under stress conditions. Everybody understand that? Okay. All right. Those are the cranial nerves that I absolutely want you to know. And then we're going to talk about another one today that carries information about hearing into the brain, okay, related to the ear. Okay, now, if you take this and you open it up, and this is not a bad section. Everybody see this? Again, one of the handouts that I gave you would have shown all the structures and illustrated all the structures. We have this little pamphlet here, this little map that actually shows many of the structures.
I really like that.
We are, what we're going to do is we are in the process of ordering a lot of these, and we're going to have these available probably next semester for people to use. But
Picture?
our dean
Already
just
got all of
just found this at a meeting she was at, and she says, "Hey, we need to get some of these." Well, okay,
Yeah,
sounds
I
good.
agree. That looks awesome.
Yeah, so I think that'll help with the dissections in particular. But anyway, if you look right here, what I use landmarks when I look at a mid-sagittal section, and one of those landmarks is this round structure. And I don't know when any of you remember that. That's part of the diencephalon called the thalamus. And the thalamus is the relay station for sensory input coming up through the spinal cord up to this area. And it synapses with other neurons that take it up to this, postcentral gyrus, where that sensation will be perceived. So the perception has to occur here. The interpretation of that, sensation would occur in this association area. And if you have to make a decision about that, that information is sent here to the frontal lobe. You make the decision, and then it's sent to the precentral gyrus, to that motor cortex, and then down to the muscles. So in other words, if I touch her, she might not like that touch, so she holds off and decides to hit me, right? That would be the process of information flow. Don't you dare. Don't you dare.
Don't touch me with them gloves.
I know. Could be a good excuse for getting. Okay, now you see that little white matter right there, that little thin layer. Okay, it lies at the top of a large cavity, which we call a ventricle. Now, because there's one